2026 is going to be a really exciting year in our market. We expect a surge of projects in the solar and wind space as folks try to take greatest advantage of the remaining time window. We expect even more of these large, clean, firm deals to come down the pipe.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
I'm Angela Adduci with the BMO Climate Institute, and today we'll be talking about clean energy. As we enter 2026, the energy landscape is entering a pivotal phase. Global demand is surging, supply chains are being redefined, and clean energy is no longer optional, but is in fact essential to the energy mix. In this episode, we'll unpack the shifting dynamics of energy demand, the growing urgency around energy security, and the market transformations underway. Our guest, Rich Powell, is the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association, or CEBA. CEBA is an organization that represents over 400 large buyers of clean energy. CEBA's members comprise 1/5 of the Fortune 500, represent more than $33 trillion in market capitalization, and include institutional energy customers of every type and size, from corporate and industrial companies to universities to cities and more. I can't think of a better guest to reflect on where the clean energy market is in this moment and what corporates and others can expect in the coming year. So welcome to the show, Rich.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela. It is great to be with you again and really excited for the conversation.
So to kick us off, CEBA represents corporate buyers of clean energy, as I mentioned. And corporate buyers are a huge driver of this market. They represent about 40% of renewable procurement. And I'm interested to hear, as someone who interfaces very frequently with these buyers, what is important to them?
So it's a really interesting time to be a corporate energy buyer because in the North American energy markets, we've moved back into growth mode. So for the first time in 20 years, energy demand is growing. We're coming out of a period that was a really great situation for buyers. So demand overall was flat. And if you were trying to buy clean electricity, usually the supply of that clean electricity was fairly abundant, prices were falling, and overall the market, because it wasn't growing, you were driving a lot of progress, you were driving a lot of impact in decarbonizing the overall energy system. Things are different now, and that's a really good sign for our economy. That means that we're reindustrializing and rapidly growing the economy in North America, and that's a really exciting time, but it does make things a little bit more complex, especially if you're trying to buy really large amounts of electricity. So to take a step back, our members care about low cost, reliable, carbon emissions-free electricity systems. And so that's both the actual electrons that they buy from the grid and then the clean energy projects that they help bring into existence so that they can, acquire and retire renewable energy certificates or zero emission certificates and all those sorts of things to help them meet their sustainability goals and commitments. And so they care about the quality of the electricity that's actually coming to them physically, and they care about their access to these clean energy projects in a way that is an affordable and foreseeable way to meet their corporate energy commitments.
This is super interesting. So you mentioned that energy demand has stagnated for, about a decade, and now it's on the uptick again. We see a lot of forecasting happening. The bottom line is we don't know how much it will increase over 5, 10, 15 years, but we do know that it will increase after having not done so for a little bit. And energy demand continues to be in the spotlight here. So do you think that we're prepared for this increase? And what do you think needs to happen for us to meet the challenge of the moment and meet these growing electricity demands?
We can absolutely meet this increase. So, it's funny, we talk all about this surge in demand. It's going from almost no growth up to just about 2% growth. And historically, we've handled 2%, we've handled 3% in the post-war period. in the 1950s, we handled 6 and 7 and 8% growth regularly. So we can do this. We can meet this challenge. And just like when you haven't exercised in a little while, things get rusty in between sessions. So it is going to take a little time to get back into robust electricity grid growth in North America. And we're seeing some of the symptoms of that getting back into shape or taking the rust off. We're seeing prices up in a number of markets, and particularly prices up for renewable energy projects, like the things that we would procure through a virtual power purchase agreement or something like that in order to get renewable energy certificates or zero emission certificates. And we're seeing in some places some issues with reliability in grids right now as we get back into this growth mode. So in our mind, the things that we need to do to really get back into this are first and foremost to continue the robust corporate clean energy buying practices we've seen historically. And there's some reasons to think that those are going to get a little harder going forward, that the rules under which we buy and account for corporate clean energy are going to get harder. And so the first thing we would argue is don't make things harder, especially at the time we're getting back into growth mode. And the second major priority, Angela, is to make sure that we're right sizing the process to build a bigger grid, to enable it to use more technology and to build a lot more generation on that grid. And that has a lot to do with the permitting systems that we use for federal environmental permitting, for example, in the United States, or to build and plan major new transmission lines or projects, or even that we use to allocate resources to just improve the grids we have today and deploy grid enhancing technologies in the near term so we can get a lot more out of the grids we have today. So we at CEBA are really involved in the permitting and transmission conversation here in DC, and then that conversation as it's evolving in a lot of the power markets around North America.
I really like that analogy of getting back into shape. I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm curious to dig in a little bit on permitting. I think this is a very complex topic, and it's almost rare bipartisan sort of consensus that something needs to happen on permitting, but in some cases, it's like what needs to happen on permitting, right? And so I'm curious to hear, what have you seen that has worked in terms of permitting reform, whether it's at the federal level or in any of the markets that you're looking at? Where have you seen some really great ideas come through around what we can do on permitting?
I'll just take the US federal level, for example. We broadly think 4 big things need to happen at the US federal level. First and foremost, we need to have a level playing field for permits of all different project types. Unfortunately, now across multiple US presidential administrations, we've seen some kinds of technologies come into favor and some technologies go out of favor. And then the things that are out of favor seem to get their permits very, very slowly or not at all. And that is not a good way to run a rapidly growing electricity grid. We need a ceasefire in this sort of the war between technologies and across administrations. So we think that legislative language would help to have sort of a peace deal across energy technologies. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to reform the way we administer some of the big environmental laws in the United States. And there's a lot that can be done to just speed up the administration of those things and make things move a lot faster through those systems. The third is that we need to reform the way we litigate over these things. So right now, if you're proposing a great big project that is in any way entangled with the federal government, meaning that it goes across state lines or it occurs on state lands or in state waters or it receives any kind of federal funding, it's open to very long and unpredictable litigation from many, many groups across the country. And we think that finding a way to shorten the timeline in which people are able to bring litigation into this. So you continue to give the public a chance to intervene in the things, but you don't let that timeline last forever. And you also limit the ability of folks to come into that unless they actually have some real skin in the game, like some real exposure to the project, not just that they disagree in concept with the project. We think that those are really powerful changes that can be made there. And last but not least, we really need to reform the way that we plan for big long-haul transmission, particularly in the United States. So right now, we don't have a robust system that requires or supports interregional planning, so knitting big power markets and big grids together in the United States. And a lot of the benefits that we would get out of seeing a bigger, better grid will come from tying big grids together so that we can transfer energy capacity from grid to grid when it's not being used in one grid, but would be highly valued in another grid. So we think those four big reforms are all possible. And we've seen limited applications of a lot of those reforms work really well in a lot of different places at the federal level and down in states and regions. We think that that could be a really powerful recipe book, if you will, to really speed up our ability to both site new generation and interconnect really large new loads and get a lot more out of the grid that we have today.
This is super interesting. Thanks, Rich. So, to zoom in on cost and pricing for a moment, there's been a lot of recent talk about the potential for data center energy demand to put pressure on consumer energy prices. I was reading some recent research out of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which suggested that residential customers have experienced larger increases in electricity costs than C&I customers, but that C&I costs are still increasing. I'm curious to hear how your member organizations are thinking about the dynamic with data centers and other factors, things like more electrification, natural disasters, costs of improvement to the grid. How are these factors increasing or impacting their costs of energy procurement?
It's a great question. And obviously, there's a lot of national conversation around this around the US, and increasingly it's coming up in elections at all levels. So, affordability is really on the front of a lot of people's minds today around all this. We think that the data center expansion done in the right way can actually be a huge help to the affordability issue. If you look deeply into what's been driving the increase, both in residential and C&I costs around the country, it's really been grid-related costs. And a lot of it's been distribution level grid-related costs. That's, we're dealing with aging electricity grids in a lot of the country. And unfortunately, we're experiencing increasing extreme weather, one of the symptoms of this, the problem that we're trying to solve with all this clean energy. And that's requiring a lot of distribution level upgrades to energy systems. Those are things that are shared by all ratepayers in a system. So interestingly, when a new load comes into the system, it actually creates more hours, more ratepayer hours across which those distribution level investments can be shared. So in some cases, you're actually seeing electricity prices going down in places where new large loads are coming in because they, in addition to sort of paying their fair share, often more than their fair share for getting themselves hooked up and the upgrades needed to the transmission system to allow them to sit on that grid, they're actually group of customers that those fixed distribution costs can be spread across. So I think that's one way that data centers can really help with the affordability issue. Another way that they can help is they can bring their own energy projects into grids. And in many cases, that's what they're being asked to do and that they're excited to do in many grids. And so in places like Georgia, for example, we, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, have worked with Georgia Power on a Bring Your Own Clean Energy program where our large buyers are going to be able to bring new clean energy projects into the Georgia Power service territory, which will then become rate-based owned projects of Georgia Power. But, we were sort of helpful in bringing those into the system and making sure that we're bringing new capacity in with us at the same time that we're bringing new load into the system so that we're not increasing the use of the existing capacity, which could potentially increase prices in those systems. And the very last thing I'll mention is you may have seen there's this increasing movement, especially amongst data center operators, to bring flexibility with them as well into the system and to say, hey, we're going to be willing to idle down the use of this data center for a certain number of hours in the year, which can really help decrease costs. Because often on the generation side, new costs are driven by new units that have to go in, peaking units that might only have to run for 50, 60, 70 hours in a year, but you've got to pay for a new unit that's only going to run for a fraction of the year because the peak demand has gone up because of that. So collectively, we think, there's a bunch of things that data centers can do to responsibly bring that new load into regions that might even help reduce costs for consumers. We care a lot about electricity costs, right? Not only are we paying them ourselves, but obviously our customers are all paying for them, right? So, every dollar that someone's got to pay in additional electricity costs is one less dollar that they can serve in our amazing retail members at CEBA, for example.
Yeah, super interesting to hear the different points of nuance around that. Thanks for taking us through that. Pivoting a bit to some of the tax credit changes that we saw back in July of 2025, resulting from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there was a lot of talk around the downturn for development of renewables that might come as a result of these changes. And now we're, a few months on. I'm curious to hear what you're seeing in the market. How are developers, how are corporates acting in anticipation of some of these sunsetting credits, and how are other types of projects sort of evolving or responding in light of some of the tax credit changes we've seen?
In 2025, we're very likely on track to have the largest year ever of corporate clean energy buying. The dynamics are changing a little bit in the mix of what people are buying. And so folks continue to buy very large amounts of solar. Wind has been on a steady downturn, unfortunately, amongst corporate buyers, or a steady flat line amongst corporate buyers now for several years, going back to even previous presidential administrations. And there's a whole bunch of factors behind that we could unpack if it's interesting. But we're seeing an increasing turn to some of the clean, firm resources as well. So we're seeing a lot more nuclear in the buying mix, geothermal. We've had 2 deals announced this year on gas with carbon capture, a very large hydropower deal announced this year amongst our members. So we're seeing a broader suite of technologies that members are taking advantage of. We do expect robust buying of wind and solar to continue at the very least through the middle of the year, because that's sort of the deadline by which projects have to commence construct in order to enjoy the full benefits of the tax credits that then would sort of allow them to take advantage of projects that are placed in service through the middle of 2030. And we expect demand for those projects to continue even after those tax credits have expired. The expected price of those projects will go up materially once those tax credits go away. And we'll feel the impacts of that a lot earlier than a lot of other folks. The power purchase agreements that we put into place usually lead the project completion and things actually coming onto the grid by several years. So by the time that we're doing power purchase agreements in the second half of next year, those may well be priced without the tax credits in them in the future. And so we'll see more expensive projects as a result of that, at least for the wind and solar projects.
Yeah, could you speak a little bit more to that mix? It's interesting to hear, wind staying flat, solar has been on an upturn. And then, if you think about solar, which is more of maybe a mature technology, comfort with financing versus something like, geothermal, which is relative newcomer, still very rapidly evolving technology. I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts on the mix of the different technologies that you've spoken about here.
It's a really interesting evolution in the mix. So historically, our members really started doing this in 2011. If you look way back from when we started tracking deals in 2014, wind was the early predominant technology. And then solar started from a very low base and then just really took off. I mean, sort of, hockey stick kind of growth for solar as costs came down and developers became more familiar with it. In a lot of ways, it is more straightforward to develop a solar project. So our members value wind projects a lot when they come into the system, but they're just harder for developers to put together and develop. They take longer. And so you're seeing fewer of them come through the total pipeline relative to the solar deals that are relative terms easier to put together and to bring into the system. On the merchant sides, depending on the market that they're in, the solar projects can often also make more in the merchant market because they're well aligned with the times of day that the grid really values the resources coming in. Although as we get more and more solar, that's less and less the case. So people really want a balanced portfolio between wind and solar. So it used to be that 50 megawatts was a big data center, then it became 300 megawatts. Now people are building gigawatt or 2 gigawatt scale data centers. And so having a limited number of transactions to have to fuel all of that electricity demand is often really, really helpful. There's also the simple reality that those clean, firm resources, because they run 24/7, 365, they have a higher capacity factor. And so if you're building a 2 gigawatt data center, for example, and you're trying to supply that entirely with solar, that's a lot of solar. So it would be solar runs 25% of the time, 25% capacity factor on average. So you'd need 8 gigawatts of solar to supply a 2 gigawatt data center, and just to get the environmental attribute certificates. And if you were also trying to actually physically use that 8 gigawatts of solar to supply the data center, you'd need to put an enormous amount of energy storage on the solar in order to do it. And collectively, that starts to become a tall order when you're talking about these really, really large installations. And so this is then leading people to look at earlier stage technologies. These are, in many cases, riskier technologies, right? We haven't done a whole lot of new commercial geothermal around the US. And so folks are finding innovative contracting models to make those projects go forward. Google, for example, last year worked with Nevada Energy to create a really innovative deal structure. They called it a clean transition tariff with Fervo, the enhanced geothermal player, which is allowing basically a new or new-ish technology to come and do a very large scale for them deployment of that technology, but to not share the risk of that, particularly with the residential ratepayers in Nevada Energy's service territory. Because often public utility commissioners and others have real concerns about, first of a kind technologies getting put on residential ratepayers and all the technology risk that comes with that. So I think we're finding new interesting contracting models that are allowing that to happen.
But you have a very high level kind of view of the energy market, the clean energy market. So I would just love to hear what your organization is anticipating for 2026 and even beyond.
2026 is going to be a really exciting year in our market. We expect a surge of projects in the solar and wind space as folks try to take greatest advantage of the remaining time window. We expect even more of these large, clean, firm deals to come down the pipe. We expect a breakthrough bipartisan legislative deal in the U.S. Congress around permitting and transmission reform. I think the stars, we've tried this 2 Congresses before. The 3rd Congress is going to be the charm. I think the stars are aligning between the right members and the right places and the right outside groups that are embracing this topic now. So we're excited about that. And we think it's going to become a heck of a lot easier to build generation and to improve grids in the years ahead. We're excited. And even outside of North America, we're very excited about the continued growth of clean energy markets around the world. We also have a global program that's heavily focused on the APAC region, and we see soaring demand for clean energy from our members and then from the supply chains of our members in those regions. So a lot of opportunity and possibility there too. And then very last, coming back to the US, there's an enormous amount of opportunity we see in the power markets and in a lot of key states. Back in 25, there was a big breakthrough agreement in the Western US to begin the process of putting together a West-wide power grid and a West-wide power market. And that has the potential to save energy buyers of all types, billions of dollars a year. It has the potential to onboard tremendous new carbon emissions-free resources in the region and really to make a much more efficient and properly functioning market with a lot more reliable energy for folks across the entire region. So as we get underway in that process and now start everybody rolling up their sleeves and starting the hard work of building another big grid and another big power market in this country, there's going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity ahead.
Well, it's great to hear that. It's great to hear the optimism and your outlook, and wonderful to get your perspective on all of this. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss here before we wrap up?
Well, I just would say a huge thanks to you for nerding out with me about all of this and for covering all of this, and really, really appreciated the time and enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer